Hi, everyone. We have a great group of speakers in this second half of the event, and thank you for sticking around. I appreciate it. Our next speaker is our keynote speaker, and he's a biologist and an author, and he focuses his research on endangered species conservation. And he's the author of some books that you might have seen out front before next to our T-shirts, Whale, and listed dispatches from America's Endangered Species Act, which is very relevant to today's topic. He's also the recipient of several awards, including the Rachel Carson Environment Book Award in 2012. So if you can please join me in giving a warm welcome to our next speaker, our keynote speaker, Joe Roman.
How's that? Is that? Yep. Okay. Great. Well, thanks so much for the invite, and thank you to Frank and Nikki and Kim and John especially for bringing me here today. I'm thrilled to be talking about the Endangered Species Act. I think what I'm going to do is take a step back from where we started this morning and look at the history of the Act. As Frank said, I'm a biologist. I'm currently I have a position at University of Vermont, and I'm visiting at Harvard. A couple of months ago, I was introduced as having gotten my Ph.D. in orgasmic and revolutionary biology, even better. And I'm still wandering the halls of Harvard looking for that department and haven't found it yet. Maybe you guys can start it. So I started thinking about, I've been interested in the Endangered Species Act since I was a kid. I first started thinking about writing a book about it, though, around 2006, 2007. I was a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington, D.C. 2006, Republicans had both houses of Congress. Bush was president. The House of Representatives passed a bill that would really have gutted, well, most conservationists thought it was really going to change the Endangered Species Act. There were two accusations there. Earlier on, this was Richard Pombo out of California. He had attacked it and saying that endangered species, why do we care? Really, his first initial attacks on the ESA were that wasn't American values, that we valued business more. He lost that, regrouped, and came back and said it doesn't work. So, yes, we care about endangered species, but the Act isn't working and it's too expensive. So I started thinking about that at that time and wanted to see if it was true. At the same time, there were some perverse consequences of some of the law in the ESA at that point. So this is the red-cockaded woodpecker. It used to be found throughout the southeast. When its habitat disappeared, it depends on longleaf pine. There's only 1% of the historical longleaf pine forests in the U.S. right now. These birds also declined as well. This is the town of Boiling Springs Lake in North Carolina. They were put on notice by the Fish and Wildlife Service. They had a few woodpeckers there. This was also time of a real estate boom. They were put on notice that they were going to have to do a habitat conservation plan and couldn't remove the remaining red-cockaded woodpeckers there. Their response? Cut down the habitat before that goes into effect, because it hadn't gone into effect. So the mayors reported as saying that that the entire county chainsaws throughout the county were gone. And lots were cleared. It was called moonscaping at that time. And even here you can see areas without woodpeckers. No woodpeckers here were more valuable than areas with woodpeckers. This is not what the ESA is supposed to do, right? Is have people go out and try and destroy habitat so they don't have endangered species, so they don't have problems. So these were the two things that were going on at that time when I started to think about how I might want to approach this story. Does it work? Is it effective? What might we do to mitigate those perverse incentives? So let's take a step back. This morning, we heard lots of really interesting conversation, both about personhood in animals and about where the Endangered Species Act is now. But let's take a step back and look at the history of it. So the first official list of endangered species was introduced by Ralph Yarborough in 1964. He was a liberal Southern Democrat, the only one to vote for the Civil Rights Act, which was passed the same year. So he was a true maverick at that time and cared about environmental issues. So he puts forward the first list into the Federal Register. On that list are 59 endangered species, 39 extinct species. I'm a biologist. They admitted that they just got a bunch of biologists in a room and said, what do you think is rare? What do we know is endangered? This was before we really had careful consideration or measures of how you consider this, but it's really important that they got this out. Some of these should be familiar to anyone who studies endangered species in the U.S. California condor was on that list, the whooping crane. Both of these really strong, whooping crane especially, strong motivating factor for protecting species. They were down in the 1960s to 25 individuals on the entire planet that they knew about. So people would every year put those numbers forward as a huge and relevant, very important concern. Black-footed ferrets, also highly endangered. In fact, they were thought extinct soon after, 10 years later, but then refound, and that's a story I won't get into today. We can talk about it later. And the American alligator was also on that list. Incredibly rare. I spoke to herpetologists who were in Florida in the 1960s. They said you could drive around Florida and not see an alligator. Think about Florida now, right? So imagine in Florida without seeing them. That's because they were heavily harvested. And then to show the true danger that these species were in, they listed all the known extinct species at that time that had come, and they would have framed it within the past couple of hundred years, included the Labrador duck, the sea mink, the passenger pigeon, which Martha just died 100 years ago. So we have the memorial for that, the last extinction of that species as well. So they're putting forward some species that are endangered, others that actually went extinct. The first species on that list, the first one that we know of that went extinct in North America, at least for the past couple of hundred years, was the Steller sea cow. It was found during Vitus Bering's voyage. He was sent by Peter the Great to look for a land bridge to North America from Russia. He was probably 10,000 years too late or so to find that land bridge, but they did get to Alaska. They got to North America. At the last minute, a young German naturalist named Georg Steller goes on board. He gets on board and he describes lots of really new species to science, strange species, including a flightless cormorant, a sea ape that's never been seen again, as well as more familiar Steller sea lion, other species, and maybe one of the most fantastical, this huge sea cow that was found in large pods along the waterways along the Aleutian Islands. Bering dies on the way back. Steller makes it back to Kamchatka, dies of alcohol poisoning or alcoholism, but not before he got these descriptions out. This is the Steller sea cow hair. There's the Steller sea lions on the upper left. That's the only drawing we know of from a living animal. Okay, so that tells you what's going to happen next. The closest relatives to Steller sea cow that are still living, their Serenidae, include the West Indian manatee, the manatee we'd see down in Florida, as well as other manatees in the tropics. This was the only Serenid that was found in the north. Manatees, about 12 feet long. In contrast, Steller sea cow is huge. All right, so we're talking about elephants today, weighs about the same as an adult male elephant. As wide around as it was long, and this is mostly fat here, so it couldn't dive. It had so much blubber that it actually couldn't dive beneath the surface. It ate kelp, so it floated at the surface. So kind of a cool, quirky creature. Unfortunately, not really good if you've got a bunch of hungry sailors coming there. Why are they coming there? For sea otters, because also Steller and Bering also described that there were lots of sea otters there. Sea otters were worth more than their weight in gold at that point. The fur was highly valuable, especially in the Chinese trade, as it turns out. So hundreds, thousands of Russian sailors come there. They use this for food. Again, these guys can't dive, so they're easily harpooned. They have another sort of touching trait. When you injure one, the other ones come and try and rescue it. So they would try and pull the harpoon out, but that also meant that the sailors could take the others. So within 27 years, we lose that species. I mean, this is a real warning about how fast species can disappear in a relatively short time. Extinction, in a lot of ways, is in our blood. That's not the first extinction that humans caused. We've been causing extinctions for certainly population extinctions, but also species extinctions for tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 years since we left Africa. Lots of records. We can follow people around the world by how populations disappear. For example, giant clams. There's a nice, easy resource. You can see when people expand the coast through Africa and into Asia by watching the giant clams disappear, because there's the first thing people took. All right. Bringing it back, if not to elephants, at least one of their near relatives, cold-adapted elephants. One of the earliest extinctions we know about is mammoths. So it's a combination, like we're seeing now, of climate change that affected the mammoths and then the expansion of humans. So 126,000 years ago, red is good. Red's grasslands. So if you see red, that means it's good habitat to be a mammoth. Okay, that's where you're going to find the mammoths. So it was warm, not a lot of habitat, but the mammoths get through. 42,000 years ago, it's cold, there's lots of habitat, but that black line is people starting to move north. So this is the earliest record of humans. By 30,000 years ago, there's an overlap with people and habitat where the mammoth is found. And if there's red there, the habitat's good, but it means there's lots of people. The mammoths are disappearing south of that black line. 21,000 years ago, humans have advanced over a lot of the habitat, and by 6,000 years ago, mammoth goes extinct. There's people, and there's not a lot of habitat. Again, another warning as to what can happen in these systems when exploitation is widespread. Again, this isn't commercial exploitation, of course. This is subsistence hunting. It's 6,000 years ago. So I work largely as a marine conservation biologist. So this is my field. Another species that was heavily exploited, another group of species that were heavily exploited and clearly impacted by human population pressure. There's a clear overlap in that habitat on land, but humans, of course, in the age of sail, started going into the oceans. The first species we hunted commercially was the North Atlantic right whale. So this was hunted by the Basques. That's the technique they used 1,000 years ago, and it's the technique used in this image as well. It lasted for hundreds of years. First record we have, 1000 AD, a sail for whale tongue. Why the tongue? You want to know why whales were so popular in Europe 1,000 years ago? They were considered fish, so they were Lenten. So you could eat it during Lent, as there was large Catholic culture, of course, there. So that was one reason they were hunted. Originally, they also had these baleen plates. So we're talking about products that come from elephants. This product was valued as basically an early form of plastic or spring steel, the way we would use things now. So fishing rods, umbrellas, those kinds of products. We knocked that population down by the early 1800s or so. Right whales, very low populations in North Atlantic. We switched to sperm whales. These are odontocetes. These are the toothed whales, Moby Dick, famous, well-known species, and really a truly American fishery. And we were hunting sperm whales largely for their oil, because it burned well. It was a clean-burning oil, and it was more dependable than vegetable oil. Vegetable oil was subject to droughts or to floods. Here, you had a good, dependable supply, and if the numbers ran out in one particular area, you just moved on. So it was the serial depletion. This is the way whaling, and we see that, I'm sure, in lots of wildlife. Hit an area hard. When populations go down, go to another area. And once you got all the populations down, then you switch to another species. We see that time and time again. The other reason that they were hunted, the right whales were hunted, was for the corsets. So this was a fashion that was started by one of the Queen Elizabeth, and at the same time, she puts forward this fashion. Catherine de' Medici in France hears about it and doesn't want to be outdone by Britain in the realm of fashion, declares that the ideal waist size was 13 inches. So like the size of a CD, right? So you can see it there. That's about as extreme as it gets, that wasp-waisted figure. Of course, it was bad for women. They would have floating ribs. It could affect your lungs. Your organs would be altered. But it was much worse for the whale. So here, and again, this was never intended to be sustainable. These are baleen plates, largely bowheads. This is a dock in San Francisco. More than 4 million pounds of baleen were landed at U.S. ports per year. Thought about this morning, and I was like, how many whales was that? I wasn't sure. And it's maybe 5,000 whales a year that they were killing to keep that. So about 800 pounds or so, or 1,000 pounds of baleen. So again, the intent was never to have a sustainable harvest. Right? That wasn't the idea. You didn't want your competitors to know where you were finding whales, but you would go in there and you would hit them hard. Now, the baleen was incredibly valuable. Baleen from a single bowhead whale was enough to pay for an entire voyage to go from New Bedford all the way around South America up to the North Pacific. So incredibly valuable. In contrast, though, the teeth of sperm whales were valueless. And they were typically, in the beginning of the hunt, they were given away to natives as some trade, or you were using the term trinket earlier. But the big risk in the whale fishery wasn't necessarily the sperm bull whales that could attack men, and it could, on rare occasion, could kill someone. The big risk was you could spend 2 or 3 years on a voyage looking for whales and not find anything. It was boredom. You had a couple of dozen men in a small place, find something from them to do. So in the early 1800s, scrimshaw arrives at that point as a way for men to have something to do. The captain's right at that time. And it's really, I would argue, maybe the earliest truly American art form, and overlaps a little bit with what we're talking about. Interestingly, I don't know of any, maybe you guys could tell me, I don't know that there's any illegal trade, at least not for live. No one's hunting live whales trying to get the scrimshaw back. It's still valuable, but as far as I know, it only comes from whales that were harvested more than 100 years ago. So let's bring it forward. Why are whales important? Besides, I like them a lot. So in the late 1960s, after Yarborough, and there were some initial Endangered Species Conservation Acts that were passed. Now, these initial acts aren't like what we have today. They were mostly to protect species in wildlife preserves, in wildlife refuges, and it was said when practicable. It was written into that. So you would preserve a species when it was practicable. In the late 1960s, Department of the Interior wanted to list 7 baleen whales that were 7 great whales that were approaching extinction, including the sperm whale shown here. So they wanted to put that on the list, and that would start controlling import. Right, it would just at least have some control on the import of these products. But at that point, it was still used in sperm whale oil was used as lubricant. So lubrication was really important. It was used as lubricant in submarines and on jets. So Defense Department said, no, we're not. Even we'll take it that they may be soon in danger. It was an argument about what endangerment meant at that time. Are they in danger of extinction or not? So there was conflict between the Defense Department and the Department of the Interior. Commerce also sided with Defense, so it didn't go anywhere. I spoke to Lee Talbot, who was in the Nixon White House at that time. He went to DuPont and got an affidavit from DuPont that said that they could make artificial sperm whale oil. So he took that affidavit to the Pentagon, and he says, within a month or a couple of weeks, they took away the objections. And that allowed for, within only a couple of months later, the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, October 1972. I don't know if it came up it did come up in broader conversation earlier about whether it's a good idea to think about elephants as exceptional. Is that the right approach, or is it limiting? Lee Talbot said that he chose whales, he chose marine mammals on purpose. He cared about all species, but he knew this was something that would have a resonance with the public. People even then cared about whales. They knew they were endangered. They're big. They're interesting. There was just about to start the whale watching movement. So he intentionally picks this law in order to pass, the big one, which is the following year. This is John Dingell here, Michigan Democrat. He introduced the Endangered Species Act, first session in 93rd Congress, and it passes 390 to 12. Just flying colors. We talk about bipartisanship. Mark Hatfield, Oregon Republican, he proposes it in the Senate, and it passes 92 to nothing. So Lee Talbot makes sure so they have two separate bills, and now they're going to have to work on bringing them together, right? Talbot, at that point, makes sure it changes some of the wording, or at least makes sure some of the wording there, he and some of his colleagues. One is, when practicable, is gone every time it says that. And when it says, as earlier it had, the secretary may, he says the secretary will. Right? So it starts really making a very strong law. He puts in the preamble not only endangered species, but also the ecosystems that they depend on, which is really important later on. So it's not just the species we're talking about, but we're also protecting those ecosystems. And that's been, there have been big battles, as we all know in the United States, about those ecosystems, about that habitat protection. Buff Bolin was second in charge at the Interior at that time. He wrote the first draft. Talbot and Potter were the ones that made it much stronger. Had it been Bolin's draft, it wouldn't have been as strong a law as we have right now. So while you have these two bills that were introduced, there's a big bust at JFK, a $5 million ring, a trade in rare cats. So we're talking about elephants. The hot item in the early 1970s were spotted coats. Some people blame Jackie Kennedy maybe for bringing that as a fashion, but it was big anyway. This is a picture, I think it's from Vogue, and I forget the number, but it may be a dozen cats you'd need for a coat. I mean, you need to kill lots of cats. This ring alone, they were accused of smuggling in 100,000 illegal pelts from Brazil, from Africa, from other places. At that time, this was perfectly timed. Nathaniel Reed, shown up there, he announces this at the CITES meeting at the time of the first meeting in Washington, D.C. to establish the Treaty on International Trade of Endangered Species. So this is all happening at the same time. The U.S. So it's presented in Washington, and the United States is the first country to ratify CITES. Again, at the same year that the ESA was being worked out in Congress, part of the law in CITES says that each nation that signs on has to have a management plan. So it's support. They're working together to bring forward both the international treaty and the national law. So end of the year, it's signed by Richard Nixon. To great fanfare. And by the way, people that were, some of the congressmen that signed on to this bill include Jesse Helms, Howard Baker, Bob Dole, people that are pretty conservative. Some would argue they might not have known what was coming because they were probably thinking, I don't know if this is true. So now I'm hearsay. They were probably thinking large animals, like big, cute animals, right? They were thinking maybe elephants or whales, but they weren't thinking about the smaller animals that were also going to be protected by this. Joyce was talking earlier today, and this is again, we're taking a step back about rights of nature. Roderick Nash put this out in the 1980s after the passage of the ESA, showing this progression from natural rights for English barons going through to Emancipation Proclamation, Civil Rights Act, 19th Amendment, and ending with protection, the rights for nature in 1973. It's far more complicated than this, and I think we're still, as we learned this morning, we're still arguing what this means. So what are the rights of nature under the Endangered Species Act? That would be, that'd be a subject of a longer conversation. We can have it afterwards. But what's clear is the law was very firm, right? It said no new extinctions. In the U.S., it also covers foreign species, but it's more effective for species in this country. So first big, where does that ripple hit first? Anyone know what's the first big flare up right after the passage of the act? So this is David Etnier, who is an ichthyologist working on the Little Tennessee River, and he finds around the same passage of the act a darter that he doesn't recognize. He's the he's the expert on darters, and he's swimming. He's snorkeling with a graduate student. He's like, I don't know what that is. Captures it. This is the Little Tennessee at the bottom, just beneath where this Tellico Dam was 80% done. There's the Tellico. He finds this, and he knows what he's got. This is a species that hasn't been described before. It's found downstream of that dam, and it depends on moving waters to breed. So here's an endangered species that is going to go extinct if that dam is completed. That's the last of 60 or so dams completed by the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they're going to come up against that. And this came up earlier. Here's the question of standing. That citizen suit provision that was written specifically into the Endangered Species Act is used then. You don't have to say, because earlier on you'd say, well, how do we have standing? The citizen suit provision makes it clear that you have standing. You can be a watchdog. You can represent the snail darter. So they bring this case. It goes to the Sixth Circuit, which puts an injunction on the dam. They say, well, the ESA is pretty clear. No extinctions. It gets flipped and then eventually makes it to the Supreme Court under Warrenberger. And Zig Plater is there. He's the lawyer that's arguing for the darter. So it's a group of citizens based in Tennessee, mostly, that are arguing for stopping this dam and protecting the species, because otherwise it's going to go extinct, right? The Supreme Court reads it and agrees, puts an injunction on the dam. No, the dam isn't going to go through. So this really upset some Tennessee politicians, especially Howard Baker, and especially Tennessee Valley Authority. So they insist on starting an Endangered Species Committee, later called the God Squad, to look at the economics of this and say, okay, maybe we can waive the law if it conflicts with something that's really essential, right? If it's for defense or for a really important economic project. The Endangered Species Committee, which is cabinet members, look at it, and they say, even though this is 80% or 90% done, closing it. That it had so little value, because they already had 59 dams in that area, that it wasn't even worth finishing it. So they pass on it. They're like, no, we're not weighing in on this. We're fine. Tennessee politicians didn't like that, so they put late-night riders on bills at that point. It's riders on a Senate bill. Well, first, it's the House of Representatives that goes there, late-night rider. Two freshmen, young politicians there. Anyone know who? Everyone knows who's on the left, right? No, do you know? Who's on the right? Everyone know who's on the left? Yes? No one ever knows this. It's funny, but when I say it, I think you'll see it. It's Newt Gingrich. He votes for the fish. Newt Gingrich says, yeah, he votes for the fish. Al Gore, young Tennessee politician, votes for the dam. Right? So I wish I could have had Andy Revkin here to help me. I tried to get Al Gore on record about this. I really didn't want to bust. I did not want to bust. I just want to know how he's reflecting back on that vote. The way that you had mentioned Aldo Leopold earlier. Aldo Leopold, the best part of that book is when he talks about it, he killed a wolf and then he changes his mind. But anyway, I've never managed to get him on record for this. There was a nice response and then they disappeared. So the Senate puts a late-night rider on a money appropriation, a must-pass bill. Carter promised to veto this, but the word is, and again, this is what I've heard through Zig Plater and others, is that he made a deal with Baker. Said he would not support the Panama Canal Treaty unless Carter signed off on this, and that was really important to Carter, was getting that Panama Canal Treaty. Whatever it was, Carter does sign the bill, and the dam is completed in 1978, and the snail darter goes extinct on the Little Tennessee. The good news, that's the bad news. The good news is that TVA was starting to get a bit of black eye at this point, and they did move some darters to nearby rivers, and they started managing their waterways a little bit. So the darters actually survive, and so well, in fact, they're now no longer endangered. They're threatened at this point. So they're doing better, but they're gone from that little Tennessee. What Plater learned and others learned is the story that they didn't tell at the time was the TVA, it was the way it was going to make its money was basically through eminent domain. It was taking land cheap from farmers there. It was going to flood that water, and then it was going to sell development, lakeside development on that side. That got out after the dam was completed. Plater, to this day, thinks if had they gotten that message out earlier, they might have managed to stop the dam. And the TVA, once that did get out, they basically they never really recovered from that. And they've even started taking dams down. They haven't built another one. Now, a cynical friend of mine says, well, to the TVA, if they're building them or taking them down, it's the same thing. It's work, right? They're making money either way. But still, the point is that we're not building really dams in the United States anymore. So not only is it about the fish, but it's also about the farmers, it's about the fishermen, it's about the habitat. And really, this law has become one of the strongest habitat laws that we have in the United States now. So if you think it's hard to argue for a snail darter, which the Secretary of Interior said at that time was the only fish story he knew where the fish got smaller every time people told the story, try arguing for a bunch of endangered mussels, right? So I'll read from Jim Williams, who's the guy that listed these. This is the fat three-ridge and the purple bank climber. Early on, Jim Williams and his colleagues knew there was going to be trouble listing mussels. They met at a bar to discuss priorities. We had to establish some rules. Is it bigger than a bread box? No. Would you feel bad if you ran it over? Not really. Is it red, white, and blue? No. What do you do with an animal that only has 1 foot and no head? They weren't manatees or bald eagles. They were living rocks. I mean, this is a real concern, right? I mean, how do we argue for this? The good news is I think I'm sure Americans still support the Endangered Species Act and are comfortable extending those protections beyond animals with a conscience, that are conscious, with a conscience, conscious. So the argument, though, I think that's important, that's often overlooked, is it is about habitat. These animals they have inherent worth, and I'd argue until I die that that's the most important thing, is we want to protect species, we want to prevent extinctions. But they also do other things. So those mussels are found at the mouth of the Apalachicola. Upriver is Atlanta. And about 5 or 6 years ago, Atlanta was going through a severe drought, and they wanted to drain more water upstream off that. And that was going to kill thousands and possibly even cause the extinction of the mussels downstream. The governor of Georgia went on the state steps, prayed for rain, and then said it's an argument against these mussels. It's a war between these mussels and your grandchildren, right? He's arguing that we need to take water off there. In Florida, though, of course, they have a different view because that is the habitat that thousands of people on the Panhandle depend on. That habitat. It's the endangered species, but it's also those flooding forests that provide storm protection. It's the fisheries there. It's the nursery for the fisheries. It's the oystermen that work there as well. And then there's also even Tupelo honey that's dependent on those flooding forests. It's this rise of what we would call ecosystem services or natural capital. I think economists or biologists are still struggling with what's the term that resonates with the public. The whole idea is, though, that we need the ecosystem, right? I mean, ecological economics, I work in that field. Earlier, it's a contrast between traditional economics, which puts the ecosystem, you have the economy, and then the ecosystems in there. Ecological economists would argue it's the ecosystem and the economy is part of it. It's flipping that view, and we depend on biodiversity for life and economics. So one of the questions that's been posed has been, does the ESA work, right? So we have this law. Is it effective? Here's one study by Michael Bean. There's more. There are better ones, that are more refined ones that have come forward, but they're all tell basically the same story. In 2008, 10% of listed species were improving, a third were stable, a third were declining, and a quarter were unknown. So when Pombo gets a hold of that, he sees the glass half empty, and he's like, this isn't working. 1 in 10 improving, and only about 25 at that point had been recovered and delisted. So they haven't even been taken off the list, right? So that's the glass half empty view. Conservationists, on the other hand, argue, well, 10% are improving and a third are stable. So most species that we know about, because these we don't know what's going on, are stable and improving. And the goal of the ESA isn't necessarily recovery, which we all want. That's a goal. But the true goal is to stop extinction. And 99% of the species that are on that list have not gone extinct. And you'd hear that argument policy-wise. One analysis estimated that the 30 years after the ESA was passed, the extinction rate would have probably caused the extinction of several hundred species in the United States. With the ESA, it was reduced to 35 or 40. When I say species, remember, under the ESA, that also means populations. Doesn't mean entire species are gone, but we lost populations. So it's not 100% effective by any rate. But I'd really let you decide which view you take on this regard when you see those kind of data. Importantly, though, I think, are the success stories. And I think this is what, as a conservation biologist and the work where I'm leading, my colleagues and I are leading now, is to start accepting success. Historically, we've been reluctant to admit success because it means you no longer have the protection. So people were reluctant. The bald eagle, for example, people were reluctant to delist the bald eagle because, partly in concerns that without those protections, you'd lose the habitat protections, and the species might go towards endangerment again. So what are a few success stories? Alligator, clearly, anybody that drives around Louisiana, Florida, sees them. There are tens of millions of alligators back. A clear recovery, and kind of what I think the people who originally wrote the ESA or signed on were thinking. Take pressure off, population comes back, delist, move on. And I really think that, and that's the dream. A lot of times, though, we bring populations down to too small numbers or habitats so reduced that doesn't happen. But alligators are back. They're still actually on the list, not because they're rare, but because their skins look like the skins of the American crocodile. So they're there not because they're their habitat or they're rare, but because they're a reference. The concern was that people trading in alligator skins freely would also start substituting rare crocodilians as well. Brown pelican. Again, probably you've all seen brown pelicans look pretty numerous down the southeast. Population up to 620,000. They were delisted in 2009. I was in North Carolina last year and started asking around this idea of shifting baselines. People in their 60s or older can remember the first time they saw a pelican. They're everywhere now. There were no pelicans. I mean, this is in the lifetime of many people that this change has occurred, that we now have hundreds of thousands of pelicans. What else changed at that point besides taking off pressure of hunting was pesticide reduction, of course, as well. So that would have made a big difference for a lot of these birds. Among the biggest success stories are marine mammals. Gray whale now at over 20,000, delisted in 1994. Though marine mammals seem to respond to the way we would have hoped, in that we really have stopped hunting them, and populations are expanding globally. Not all populations. I don't mean to oversell this. There's a conservation crisis among marine mammals too, but here is really probably our best success story. Is the Marine Mammal Protection Act is really working in many cases. So in the North Pacific, off of Alaska, 1,400 humpback whales in 1960. They're now at 21,000. Western Australia, product of International Whaling Commission restrictions on On commercial hunting in the 1980s, there were 600 in 1960. There are 25,000 now, doing incredibly well. Gray seals, 35,000 in 1977. There are now 349,000. Someone was mentioning pests and looking at that. Here's one of those species that used to be rare that now is considered by some people, it's abundant, it's considered a pest. No matter how you look at it, though, marine mammals, clearly this has been powerful. Fortunately, we haven't seen that rise in poaching. Probably, I don't know, had we been having this conversation two decades ago, maybe we would have been encouraging about elephants too, that they were an upward trend. Perhaps one of the biggest success stories are elephant seals, down to only about 100 individuals in the 1960s, very much on the edge of extinction. There are now 225,000 in the North Pacific, probably as abundant as they ever were. Here's like where you get back to that historical baseline. These are individual elephant seals. They're probably in this photo alone 10 times more elephant seals from this particular photo than there were in the entire planet in 1960 before we started protecting them. Protected in the U.S. as well as Mexico. So not all species can we just take the pressure off and they'll just respond immediately. Peregrine falcons are a good example since they were extinct in the East, so it doesn't matter what you did with the pressure. So what we've done with peregrines and several other species is begin reintroduction. So the reintroduction of the peregrine falcon began in 1974. We probably wouldn't do it this way again. It was basically they just took it from different stocks, from individuals from around the planet, mixed them up, and bred them and then hacked them and released them. The good news is they came back. Have people seen peregrines around here? I don't know if they have in New Haven. Yeah, so they're doing incredibly well. They were delisted in 1999. Now we're having to play around a little bit more, right? This isn't conservation where you just take the pressure off and they'll come back. Here we're starting really to change the genetics. And I think probably one of the big stories on that is, anyone guess what this is? I heard it back there. Yeah, Florida panther. Florida panther. So down to 25, 35 individuals in the 1990s. People were writing them off. They're gone. They exhibited a kinked tail. There was a cowlick. Lots of the males, the testicles didn't descend. Signs of inbreeding in cats. They were down to a few. All of them were closely related. And the question was, and this was really bitterly fought out in the conservation community, do we bring in some genes, some cougars from other areas and allow them to breed with these Florida panthers in order to avoid inbreeding? Or is it a habitat problem? Or are we even allowed, because initially the ESA said hybrids weren't protected, are we even allowed to bring in new genes? Or is that no longer a Florida panther, and that means it'll be off the Endangered Species Act? That was hotly contested. In the 1990s, Fish and Wildlife changes its policy. Another species, the dusky seaside sparrow, had gone extinct while they were arguing that out. They didn't want that to happen again. They decided to allow 7 female cougars to come from Texas. They were released in there, and there are now 120 panthers in Florida. I didn't say Florida panthers because they're like 70% cougar now. They're 70% of their genes come from Texas. This is not probably, no one was thinking that in the 1970s, that this is how we were going to start managing species. But it's done all the time in Africa. In South Africa, the lions and other individuals are moved all around. Qualified success. I think it was the right move, and I think it was the only move. I think we would have no panthers in Florida right now had we not done that. But, clearly it's complicated. Another shift has been, these are whooping cranes. The single population has grown to about 200, the single wild population. But there was a concern that one population, which flies between Texas and Canada, if the disease hit that population, or if a storm event or something happened, we could lose all whooping cranes. So Operation Migration, folks started taking single eggs from the nests of wild whooping cranes and bringing them and rearing them at Chaskawitzka in Maryland. Not Chaskawitzka, at, I'm drawing a blank at anyway, at a facility in Maryland, and raising them with puppets, so they didn't see people. You would feed them with puppets. They'd raise them among sandhill cranes, so a close relative, and also, actually, even in the egg, they would hear the sound of an ultralight. They'd make the sound, they'd play recordings of this plane from the egg on, so that they would imprint on this plane and follow that migration pattern. Originally, they had started in Nisita. That hasn't worked. They've switched. So this is just a couple of weeks ago updated. And this, so as of about 2 weeks ago, they're right here. So they're following a plane down south to Chaskawitzka, which is a national wildlife refuge, in an attempt to start a second population. I don't know. The results are okay. I mean, it's a grand experiment, and it hasn't really worked. We don't have a breeding wild population. But this is, where conservationists, in a sense, come to, is we're going to have to be meddling more and more unless we were to restore habitat, unless we achieve what E.O. Wilson would argue, bringing 50% of habitat protected, about 50% of the planet, rather, as protected habitat for wildlife. Then we might not have to meddle as much. But until we get there, we're going to be left with this. One of the big success stories, and one of the most controversial, is the return of the gray wolf to the Rockies, to Yellowstone and Idaho, starting in the mid-1990s. Ed Bangs, Doug Smith, some other folks, released about 20 or 30 gray wolves that were captured in Canada in those two areas. One was a hard release, take the wolves in Canada, drop them in the mountains of Idaho and let them go. In Yellowstone, they were more cautious. They brought them to a pen, fed them, and then released them as a soft release. Didn't matter. They did well in both places. This is 301, which was a well-known wolf among wolf watchers in Yellowstone. Amazingly, they're very visible. When they're in Canada, they hide. They're hunted. You don't really see wolves, but in Yellowstone, wolf watching has become very popular. This species was delisted through legislation. Again, controversially was delisted. But the point is that certainly the restoration effort has been successful. We'll see what we do post-restoration, whether we can maintain those populations or not. This is the red-cockaded woodpecker again. One of the shifts to address those perverse incentives that I mentioned earlier on, the idea that people would cut down wild habitat so they don't get invasive species on their property, has been what are called habitat conservation plans. Basically, permitting landowners, if you're a landowner and you have a big forest, a big stand of longleaf pine, rather than go and cut it down because you might want to develop it someday and are afraid that a woodpecker will come on your habitat, what you could do is sign up with the government and say, look, I have zero. Here's my habitat. I don't have any woodpeckers. That gives you a permit in the future to cut that habitat down, even if the woodpeckers come in. It's called a no surprises policy. Basically, to reduce the motivation to cut down your habitat. Does everyone love this idea? No. Again, this was controversial when it first started. But it's part of a shift in the ESA for habitat, which is, it used to be prohibitory, and I would say now it's more of a permitting process. This law is much more about permitting in those areas. That's for the habitat. That having been said, incredibly important. It's our strongest habitat law. For sure, that we have in the U.S. Maybe Wilderness Act, too, incredibly important, of course. What hasn't been so controversial, I think, has been the using the ESA to protect against direct harvest, direct kills. Certainly, that is not something, at least I haven't seen that. The habitat protection, there's pushback, but the idea, these are any violations that involve direct take usually are prosecuted. Where does that fit in? We talk about value. The philosopher J. Baird Callicott said one way you can view people's values is by how much you're punished if you break that law. So where does the ESA fit in there? Michael had mentioned narcotics and trade in human organs. So wholesale distribution of narcotics, 10 years to life, $4 million fine. trafficking in human organs, 5-year prison term, and a $50,000 fine. Violating the ESA is a 1-year maximum prison term and $50,000 fine. More than prostitution, but not as much as distributing drugs, for whatever it's worth. That's about where it fits. But we are still prosecuting cases like this. In 2009, a man pleaded guilty killing a Hawaiian monk seal, and he got a 90-day jail term. And these are still, I would argue, prosecuted pretty aggressively. So the federal laws regulating the sale of wildlife, just so we have it, I don't think it's come up today. We've discussed the Endangered Species Act, bans the interstate and international sale of listed species and the products made from them. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, passed 100 years ago, and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, they protect the commercialization of protected birds, migratory birds. Marine Mammal Protection Act, discussed already, limits the sale of marine mammal parts, except for Native Alaskans. So we stole whale in the United States. Native Alaskans can kill marine mammals and whales. And then the Lacey Act is really what maybe is the muscle of all these. This is when you hear prosecution about commercial trade, it's typically under the Lacey Act. Basically, it's a federal crime to take wildlife across state boundaries. If the law in one state protects that species, then you're breaking a federal law if you bring that species across the border. And also, similarly, if you're bringing those species, if you're importing them illegally outside the U.S. There was recently a bust done by the Fish and Wildlife Service looking at species that were for sale on the internet, widespread bust. Maybe Andy will talk about that later. So there are permits that you need to traffic in wildlife products if they're not CITES listed, or depending on where they're listed. This is Peter Braziadis, who is a forensic herpetologist. I doubt there are many people that have that job. But when the Fish and Wildlife Service gets skin, say, for crocodiles or amphibians or reptiles, he compares that to the morphological. Do they look like the species that it says on the permit? And if he doesn't think they do, then DNA analysis occur, and then this particular case is Cayman, and it was mislabeled intentionally to bring them in, I believe, from Venezuela, and these guys, the people that were bringing them in, were busted, and this was confiscated. So the permitting process, I think, is also pretty well enforced. Scientists also have to have permits to study wildlife. This is a stork that was kept that had a tag on it. So there was a tag following its migration. It was captured by the Egyptian police a couple of weeks ago because they thought it was spying. So it has this tag that you can see on the back of there. This is still an open question, whether you're allowed to do this. Do you need a permit for a species to fly into there? This is an issue with marine mammals. So we're dealing with permits. They released it. So he is in prison there, the poor guy. But it has a sad ending, I'm afraid. So he landed in another marsh and someone killed it and ate it. Nonetheless, and that was against the law in Egypt. But we're still struggling with that permitting question. So does the ESA work? It certainly works with species if we are willing to pay to fund to do the recovery or to do the research. It doesn't work. There's plenty of studies that show, for example, most invertebrates and plants, they don't get $50,000 a year. That's not enough to do the paperwork that would associated with it. Certainly not to do any research or any actual restoration efforts. Fish, we tend to fund fish and mammals. That's really, so fish probably because we eat them, and mammals, for whatever reasons, we find that their mammals and birds are more important. I wanted to look at where that bias comes from towards mammals, and that came up a little bit this morning. So I looked into my daughter's toy chest to see what animals she had. Is this bias something that comes from childhood? And since I do genetics, I made a phylogenetic tree, an evolutionary tree, for where her species fall out on that tree. And indeed, 21 of the animals in her toy chest are mammals. Fortunately, she didn't have a lot of dolls. They were mostly, maybe because she's a daughter of 2 biologists. Yeah, 2 fish, 1 crustacean, an isopod, definitely because her dad's a biologist. I don't think most kids have pill bugs in their thing. In fact, she found it really scary, and that's no longer in the toy, especially when the antenna came sort of poked out of the ring. Anyway, there is clearly a bias here that we do protect the larger species, and we fund those larger species. Keep in mind, as I had mentioned, I've been talking a lot about success stories, but there's a real crisis worldwide for biodiversity. This is from the IUCN Red List. 1 in 3 amphibians is in danger of extinction, 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 5 birds, 1 in 5 flowering plants, and this is just the beginning. These are just a few of the groups that have been studied. Why does it matter here locally? Some of the research that I do is looking at the impact of biodiversity on human health, not only psychological health, but also on on infectious disease, as it turns out. So I imagine everyone knows what that is if you live here in Connecticut. Black-legged tick, and the cause of the vector for Lyme disease, Borrelia bacteria being the cause, the infectious agent. So it passed through the black-legged tick, and recent studies have shown that biodiversity can act as a buffer, protecting against Lyme disease. It's called the dilution effect. The more animals that you have, the more wildlife, the more diversity, the less likely that disease is going to be passed off. Lyme disease, this has also been found in West Nile virus and several other vector-borne diseases. When you have a lot of species, the number of infected ticks goes down because a lot of those species are dead-end hosts. If it bites it, the Borrelia dies and it doesn't pass on the disease. The main host for this is not deer, as many people think, but it's the white-footed mouse that is the main carrier, or the best host for that. It also turns out that this is usually the last species left when it's the last one standing. It's the one that's going to be found around your house. So it's part of the reason you have that risk. We've been looking at patterns of restoring wildlife to see if that can help buffer disease. And I think diseases are really what's one of the big emerging issues, not only for people, but for wildlife as well. Anyone hear about white nose syndrome? Yeah, so most of you are familiar with it. First seen in the Adirondacks about 5 or 6 years ago. It affects cave-dwelling bats. This is a little brown bat, and there you can see the white nose, the fungus that's on its face. As far as we know, it causes a rise in metabolism, so when they're hibernating, they lose energy and mass and eventually start flying out even in midwinter, basically, we assume, because they're starving. Massive die-off. 90%, 95% of cave-dwelling bats, as this has expanded, have been impacted. ESA, not really prepared for this. The Endangered Species Act, this is an emerging disease. We see it in salamanders, we see it in amphibians, we're seeing it in lots of other species. And this likely got to the U.S. from caves, possibly, we don't know how, from caves in Europe to the United States, because it is found among native bats in Asia. So that's going to be a big shift. I want to wrap up by I think we asked earlier, what can you do? Well, some people that are making a huge difference on a small scale, maybe, but really they're at the front lines of conservation. This is Jeff Brigler. He's the state herpetologist in Missouri, and I went there to work on a piece on the Ozark hellbender, which I'm holding there. Only 600 individuals left suffering from diseases and possibly other complications. But when I spoke to Jeff, dinner after spending a day on the water, and I caught my own hellbender, which is a highlight of my year and maybe even longer managing to find one of these. he said that he would consider his career, his life, a success if as many species, as many amphibians and reptiles that were in Missouri when he started his career, if they were all there when he ended his career. That's huge. That's a really demanding thing to do that because, you know, he has to deal with the realities, on-the-ground realities of four-laning, of making very difficult decisions. It's not like what he says goes. But I think, to me, that was really moving, really important. This is going to make a difference for the future of life on the planet, how we present, we stop, what we do about extinction right now. That green line, it presumes what we would call a background extinction rate, the normal amount of extinction you'd expect on the planet. 5 million species on Earth, more or less. 1% extinction rate, we're down to 4 million by 2300. And if we don't, you know, if the extinction rate continues to accelerate, stays at 5%, we're talking a million species on the planet by 2300. So 1 in 4 out of 5 species will disappear in that time. So that is going to have an impact on the entire future of the Earth. I'm happy to take questions. I want to say one thing because I always feel bad. I spoke a lot about animals today, but plants really do matter. They are protected under the ESA, and they're essential. I mean, you need to protect them. I need to make that earlier in my story, though, because I kind of spoke a lot about bigger plants. Happy to take questions. Thanks.
When I attended the International Whaling Commission meeting one year, I got an up-close view of the permits to grant Alaska Natives, right?
Yep.
The right to kill bowhead whales. And then I saw that you had a growth of 5,000 to 10,000, which was smaller than growth in other whales. Knowing the culture of these communities, I've been to some of them, cash economies. I mean, it isn't igloos. You know, it's not about eating bowhead or going hungry. It seems highly frustrating that there's no challenge at all to that so-called cultural need, and that automatically they're granted permits to kill bowheads when the growth clearly isn't great and the need is non-existent.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think there are some concerns with the exemption for Alaska Natives. Not so much, honestly, with bowheads, but with sea otters. There have been some people who have been concerned about that. I'll tell you, most conservationists and most marine mammalogists I know are okay with that exemption. Not all, by any means, and most are not comfortable with commercial whaling. So, and I would say I've kind of fit in that most, I'll be honest, in that I think here was a hunt that was going on for, we know, at least 2,000 years. And we don't know of any impact to the whale populations. Definitely impact to the individual whales, no doubt. And we changed that system. I mean European colonization changed that system. And I think it's an important cultural, it's still something that matters to that culture. But there's room for disagreement there. This is my own personal opinion on that.
I think it's prickly. You know,
Yeah.
I understand. I mean, it kind of bleeds into an area of, but if you're up close with the actual culture there, you've spent weeks in those communities. You've eaten in the Mexican restaurants. You're going to the bars and visiting the hotels. It's ludicrous. And yet nobody really has the courage to challenge it.
Yeah, I think politically it would be difficult.
Right.
But, you know, I mean, there's room for disagreement on that, I think. But point taken, very much so. Yeah.
About civil provisions, about criminal provisions, and about government acts as reintroductions. In your opinion, what works?
What's that? What works for reintroduction or for?
No, for preservation, because we have a lot of things that interact. But if you were a legislator, what do you think you should? What is the next step? Where you should invest the tax dollars?
Yeah, I guess I personally, if I could divide it, habitat is the first decision. And I've spent time in Brazil, it's the same thing. I mean, that's really, these species aren't going to come back without habitat preservation and restoration. You've got to do that. Clearly, though, as the Marine Mammal Act, Protection Act has shown, if you stop hunting species, if you reduce pressure, then and you aggressively enforce it, that'll be effective as well. And then we live in a world where it's a human planet. We're going to have to be moving species around and restoring them. I'm not going to give you a single answer because you need to do all three of those. And I probably would say maybe I would go habitat restoration and then overexploitation. But that's maybe because it's the U.S. and poaching, it happens here, but it's not as big. That's my sure. And that there are many others. We're doing a study right now to look at what causes conservation successes in following on that. So get back to me in next year and I'll have a better answer.
G'day, Dan Ramp from the Centre for Compassionate Conservation in Sydney, Australia. Great talk about the Act and what it can do, but you know, the one thing that perhaps you haven't touched on very much is monitoring. Because without information, the Act's powerless. And, you know, for many species that are protected under the Act, for example, in Western Australia, short-range endemic invertebrates are very important so that when mining companies want to go and explore land for development, they have to go and do surveys.
Right.
And those environmental impact statements are done by consultants. And there's almost collusion with the federal government in that really these are cryptic species. They go there once, have a look, did we see any? These are like wolf spiders and things like that, trapdoor spiders. They're hard to find. That's why they're short-range endemics. They don't find them, so the mine goes ahead. No mines are ever stopped because were there species there that are endangered? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So could you comment on how important monitoring is and what our efforts are?
Yeah. So I totally agree with you. I mean, without monitoring, we wouldn't get anywhere. So you need to, well, one, you need to do surveys and then get the monitoring. That's part of the problem with that slide where a third of even, this isn't all U.S. species. These are just the ones that are, they have legal protection, and we still don't know at least a third of them what's going on almost at all. We don't know whether they're increasing, they're declining. There's no way that the ESA can be working if we don't even know what's going on with those populations. So without that, the problem is that we give them $50,000 a year to monitor that species. And again, that's not going to do there's no way you can do anything with that. So what we've depended on a lot of ways in the U.S. is NGOs to take up that, like Nature Conservancy or Wildlife Conservation Society. They often are there stepping in to do that. They're not going to do it on private land, though. So that's part of the problem is those private areas are going to be a concern. I think I'll stop there, but the other concern is what we call critical habitat, which is under the ESA, and so what that means for land use under that area. But anyway, totally agreed. You need to do that, and it's true for marine mammals and IUCN Red List in general. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Liv Baker from Wesleyan again. So we were talking a lot about the importance of habitat protection, but what can you say about the role of mitigation and the effect of that when land is actually taken for development or some other use, and the idea that, we'll just mitigate in some other area? And
so sort of like the habitat conservation plan that I had introduced,
right,
you mean?
Right.
So I've spoken to folks at Fish and Wildlife, and they thought it was that the passage of that was necessary because there was strong opposition in Congress at that point. This was Clinton administration, and just after Newt Gingrich actually took over. So they knew that they were going to have to save. They thought that they're going to have to save the act, and they're going to have to make some modifications. And part of that's going to be these habitat conservation plans. So this was under Babbitt, and the folks that I spoke to said they sincerely thought that this could be effective. But then a change of administration, the administration doesn't support that. If you're not on the ground defending this mitigation and making sure it happens, it's totally ineffective, I think. So you need to have people out there. It's not ideal, by the way. So certainly I'm not arguing this is the way that we would ideally do it, but it's it's just politically, I don't know if it's necessary, but that was the decision made to move forward. You were going to say, did you want to follow up on that?
I mean, from my experience, land that's used to mitigate, oftentimes the quality of that habitat is really good.
Yeah, that's that's right. I think so. Red cockaded woodpeckers, it's actually been decent. So there's one species where it's worked fairly well. And this brings about conservation trading is out there as a possibility too, where you can trade permits and this would be, it's put forward for Utah prairie dog, I think. So one area wants to develop a particular place. They buy permit from another place outside of town. If it's done well and everyone is truly working within the system and you're actually going to pick the right areas, it could result in an improvement. If it's done poorly, it's a disaster, though. I mean, it's case by case in that regard. But good question, certainly. Yeah.
You mentioned for the Florida panther that they were so few that they were inbreeding. At what point, or how many animals can you think, okay, they can come back without worrying about the gene pool being so small?
Wow. Yeah, gosh.
Inbreeding and not have healthy animals.
I could give you 100 papers to answer that, 100 papers that have tried to answer that question. 500 was a number that people used to throw around. I don't think we're using that minimum viable population number anymore. It certainly varies according to what organism you're talking about. Ideally, you want to get it while they're still playing an ecological role. When they're still abundant enough where they're part of the ecosystem. That would be sort of, that's not a number, but at least it's a goal, let's say. Then questions of inbreeding, there are people that have looked at that for what's called an extinction vortex. So when do numbers get so small that they're likely just to go right down to zero? For a group of red cockaded woodpeckers, it was 25. For other species, for grouper, for other species, you need thousands of individuals. Pigeons, maybe you needed millions to sustain those numbers. So it varies, and I wish I could give you, people have long tried to find like a single number, but I don't have one, I guess. Abundant, before they get rare. Yeah.
In nature, wouldn't there be an acceptable percent of extinctions anyways? So, and obviously we can never maybe even reach that anyways.
It would be hard for us to reach the present planet. But yes, I mean, there also are several papers looking at that. There's a background rate. One species are like one every million years or something. I forget what the number is, but it means like an average species has a 1,000,000-year lifetime, and then after there certainly are studies about that. The most recent one in Science said we're at 10 times higher than the background extinction rate. I've heard numbers as high as 1,000. And it's another one of those, like you all ask these questions that, like, I could give you 20 or 30 research papers that argue about this. There's no one denies that we're at a higher extinction rate than the background rate, that we're at an accelerated number. And the extinction, every species on the planet goes extinct, including us. I hate to tell you guys, but it's true. You know, all species that have ever existed have gone extinct, and they will, but that doesn't, just like everyone will die. You know, we're all going to die. Species go extinct, but if we're going to protect this planet, for the planet itself, for the animals, for ourselves, we need to reduce that extinction rate and bring it as close to that background rate as possible. Zero anthropogenic extinction is the goal. My goal.
Sensational talk in every way. Thank you so much. Such an honor. I do want to warn you when you said check with me next year. We're going to do that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right